Well, it's very nice to be here and to see everybody, and be nice to see everybody, I guess, in the crowd. But we'll do with what we got today. So today's topic is how to future-proof your red team, and I'm going to get into my background in just a second. But I want to kind of kick off with kind of what this topic is and why. And it really boils down to the push for offensive security. And so a lot of us are familiar, especially being at the executive level in an organization in charge of security, with the push on offensive security, adversary emulation, pen testing, red teaming, call it what you will, but the push to identify our threats in a proactive way, not a reactive way, before the adversary is capable of finding those exact same holes or vulnerabilities. And so a lot of us have seen this kind of progression over the last decade of offensive security kind of moving to the limelight, moving forward when it comes to your overall security posture, where before it used to be kind of the hacking subculture and it was part of cybersecurity, but kind of the smaller part. And now with the advent of things like breach and simulation, the entire BaaS industry, it's really come to the forefront. And it's really sparked a lot of conversation. I've been a part of a lot of these conversations of what should we be doing in the offensive security space? What's the correct balance for manual red teaming versus breach and simulation? How much do I spend on that? This proactive offensive security versus the reactive defensive security of things such as EDRs, AVs, and so forth. And so because of all of those challenges and all of those questions, this is a big topic I wanted to talk to you about. So we're going to talk about how do you approach the topic of offensive security and really future-proof your organization in a way that you're not just going out of budget on every aspect of cybersecurity. So let me pop over into the deck. All right, so why listen to me? Why should you really pay attention to the kind of the perspective I have on this? So I'm the CTO at Prelude Research. We're an offensive cybersecurity company. We're partnered with organizations like Mitre Corporation here in Washington, D.C., which is where I'm based. Also with companies like Elasticsearch and some other big technology companies. Before joining Prelude, I built several different public and private offensive security platforms. So the way to really view my career is kind of through the lens of two different careers at once. I've worked for the US government as an offensive cyber operator, OCO, for a large portion of my career, while at the same time in a parallel career working for a lot of large tech and security companies. So I've worked at organizations like John Deere, Rockwell Collins. I've worked at Mitre Corporation for a few years. I was on the attack leadership team, if you're familiar with the attack framework, and a couple of small security companies such as CyberSecurity and so forth. And so I've spent a lot of my time in my career focused on the challenges of offensive security, both from the government impact side. How can we achieve a more positive impact, a safer world through the work that I did with the US government, as well as the corporation side on the enterprise? How can we make companies more secure that we can focus on producing what we're producing? So every company isn't a security company, but security is a mechanism for us to be able to achieve business at the end of the day, which is kind of the fuel for our economy and the rest of moving this country forward. And so that's a lot of my background. I've spent about 15 years doing this type of work, and I focus mostly on that offensive side, but have obviously kind of interwoven the defensive sides as well, as I kind of see a lot of correlation there. There's a couple of ways that you can get a hold of me, by the way. Private Ducky is my handle on Twitter, and you'll see that I post on a lot of these topics that I'll talk on today at feed.prelude.org. All right, so two of the recent projects that I have built in the open source that are public cybersecurity, offensive cybersecurity projects are the Mitre Caldera Framework. If your security team is familiar with this one, I was the project lead and the designer of Caldera version 2.0 and up. And so this is a completely open source program or framework that Mitre has supported and currently supports to this day. And this is really around research in decision-making, specific to offensive security. And then currently I have been working on the Prelude operator. So this is a similar free and open source program developed to kind of simplify offensive security so more people and more organizations can access it. And you're capable of doing things really for free or at a very small price to try to make it the entire concept of the field more accessible. All right, so Dunder Mifflin. As we dive into this topic, how to future-proof your red team, the first thing that I want to do is kind of frame what a red team is. How do we get value from the red team? What does a red team actually technically do in the lens of every company, every government? What are they doing? There is some variance here, but it's a very mysterious, kind of shady area where there's a lot of gray space and lack of definitions. And so what we're going to do is we're actually going to simulate what a red team would do if they were to, say, attack the Dunder Mifflin office in the Office television series. And so I've got the blueprint here. And by the way, this is pretty typical for a red team. You'll start with an actual physical diagram of both the office space as well as the network diagram that you're capable of piecing together through what's called OSINT, open source intelligence, really mainly Google Dorks, searching around, looking on YouTube for videos, trying to piece together what an office may look like. And so we're going to start off with that. And so in our kind of simulated red-blue exercise, which a lot of you on this call may be very familiar with this process, this is how a red-blue exercise should go. So we'll go ahead and stage the blue team over here in the annex. So if you're familiar with this TV series, some of these layouts and conference rooms and such will make a lot of sense. We're going to go ahead and stage this blue team over here. They are kind of all clustered together. You've got all the monitors. They've got the detection, the SIM up, the EDR dashboards. They're tracking what's going on in their production and development networks. And let's go ahead and move the red team over here in the conference room. So some red-blue exercises will include knowledge. So the blue team is aware that the red team is there on site or going to attack them. Other red team assessments, the blue team's kind of in the dark of where the red team is, or that there is a red team operation happening that day. And so in this case, we're just going to stick the red team up here in the conference room. Typically, you have 3 to 5 red teamers that are going to participate in a security assessment. And we're going to say that their target, the red team, what they want to do is they want to get to Michael's computer. And so Michael's the boss. Their goal is to get remote code execution, RCE, on Michael's computer. And so you can see I drew a circle around Ryan. They're probably looking at Ryan and saying, okay, if we want to get to Michael and we don't see a direct path, maybe the best way to get to Michael is to go through Ryan. So they're kind of going through this mental evaluation using their knowledge of both the office space here, the layout, the technology, if they did some sort of reconnaissance ahead of time, and then utilizing their knowledge of just TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures, and different attacks that they're familiar with to identify these different risks, threats, and vulnerabilities. And so they say, okay, well, we want to get to Ryan. The best way to get to Ryan very well may be hitting the finance department. So you'll see the circle over here on Angela, Kevin, and Oscar. And so the red team says, hey, let's go ahead and see if we can get an agent running on one of the machines, one of the laptops of the finance department. Not only can they then collect some of the financial data of the company and start to pivot from there, they can use this initial foothold, as it's called, in order to laterally move over to Ryan's computer next. Now, this is the process, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in just a minute, but they're going through these mental cycles of, I need to attack here to move to there. I need to process this input in my brain in order to understand, am I going to get detected if I do this? What is the benefit, the kind of that cost analysis of what are the pros and cons for each move I make. Now, from Ryan's perspective, he may be the perfect initial foothold to Michael, because maybe Ryan sends a phishing email that Michael tends to fall for. And so we can spoof that coming from Ryan's machine. Michael gets it, and all of a sudden we get remote code execution. And the blue team is, either blissfully unaware, or they're tracking some of this, catching bits and pieces. And this is kind of how a red team operation is intended to go. And they'll last, call it a week. I've seen some go as long as 2 weeks. But it's pretty typical for this to be a 3 to 5 day exercise. Now, the purple team, which is a relatively new addition to the security assessment space, they're going to sit with both the blue and red teams. You can see a little bit of participation in both of these rooms. And the goal of the purple team isn't dissimilar to DevOps when it comes to system administrators and software engineers. So they're kind of the glue. They can talk both red and blue. And so they're capable of communicating between these two groups, making sure that the value of this assessment is good. That is always a positive kind of end result. And so they may help the blue team understand what to look for with red team results. And then they may be over helping the red team with prompting attacks that would be good for the blue team to attempt to detect. So you're going to get a little bit of a mix there, but the goal here is for them to be the glue between these two teams. Now, the purple space is relatively new. Last couple of years, it's gained a lot of prominence. And so a lot of organizations now that I'm familiar with and working with are starting to really staff up their purple team. And that's probably the fastest growing aspect of the cybersecurity teams that I'm seeing right now is in that purple space. Now, what does a red team assessment actually look like? So that's what it's intended to look like. But what it actually kind of boils down to, it's a little bit different. So you've got the blue team over here, you've got the red team there, and you've got a couple of days that go by, and you're in the exact same spot. So I've been on hundreds of red teams, maybe thousands over the course of the last 15 years. Between participating, overseeing, and just advising on. And this is your typical case. The first couple of days of the red team assessment, the teams are getting set up, specifically the red team, and they're having to get their laptops re-imaged. They're having to set up networking in the specific area that they're red teaming. And so it's a process for them to attempt to get to the point of attempting to get their initial foothold. Now, they may want to get to Michael's computer and may want to get to it through Ryan, but that may be your ideal case, but they're going to have to go with what they can accomplish in a short period of time. Where an adversary has multiple years, essentially unlimited time and unlimited money to accomplish an operation, the red team's confined to about 3 to 5 days. So they really can't choose the best path. They need to choose the most efficient path. So they may locate Daryl in this case, and they may drop some USB sticks with agents that will start immediately when you plug them into a computer. They may drop those in the parking garage, the outside, and hope that Daryl picks one up. He plugs one into his computer in the office, and all of a sudden you have initial access on Daryl's machine. Now, as soon as you do that, what is typical is the blue team will immediately see this action because most of the time they're in the loop as far as the operation happening, and they will firewall the red team. Day one of activity, the red team is now blacklisted from the office. They're firewalled out, and they can't get anywhere else. Now, the blue team kind of celebrates. One of them may pop over to the break room in this case, open his phone and go to Twitter and start tweeting about how the blue team was able to defeat the red team. And that kind of sparks you into this competitive mindset of red versus blue. And so with that, the purple team that was working with the red and blue sides now head for the stairs, and they are out of there because you end up with this competitive feeling of, can I beat the other side? Is the other side cheating or taking what are called white cards in order to move from one step to the next in the red team assessment? And then you kind of get the emphasis on that instead of the security of the organization, which is the intended focal point of a red team assessment. Now, what's the value here? Why are we doing these? So we talked about some of the pros and cons through that kind of silly little example, but hopefully gets a little bit of thought into what these are. So what is the value? So the very first one is the most obvious: to become more secure than before. But is that really true? So if you've been a part of or funded a number of red teams, you may have the assumption that you're more secure after the exercise than you were before. But you don't become more secure just by nature of running the exercise. because that is your awareness piece. You're gaining awareness of where the adversary may attack and what sort of success they'll have along the way, but you're not necessarily secure. You're definitely not secure just by running the assessment. Now, there's typically the last day of a red team assessment that we didn't talk about in our example. That is the hot wash. It's where the red team kind of goes through what they did, what they were able to accomplish, and what they believe the implications of their actions were in terms of defense. And the blue team kind of sits back, kind of consumes it, asks some questions, and then gets handed a list of things to fix. The last government red team that I was a part of, we did this pretty heavily, and we did a 4-day red team assessment of a specific Air Force network. And after the operation, it's 4 days, it's kind of condensed and packed in. We sat down and handed the defensive unit I think it was around 34 pages. And this was the first draft. We were going to draft up a longer one after, but a 34-page checklist of all the things we did that we think they need to address. Now, that is helpful and not helpful at the same time. It's good to have a comprehensive list of where all of your holes are, but if it's too comprehensive and you don't have the prioritization of these items, then you're just giving the defensive team something that is effectively a paperweight that they're going to use. They're going to need a paperweight for that many pages. Second value of a red team exercise is, and you may be looking at it for this perspective, security compliance is now satisfied. A lot of organizations, depending on the industry you're in, may require a red team assessment in order to move to the next stage of product development, or just based on your industry itself, you just may have to do these on occasion across your network. A red team assessment is a great way to obviously achieve security compliance, but it's not necessarily, if you don't put the focus in the right place, you're not going to get value out of just the security compliance aspect. A red team I did a number of years ago was for a defense contractor, and we needed to do security compliance for a new jet that was going out. There's some products on a jet that needed to be essentially red teamed, all the software within them. And through the process of going through that compliance, going from point A to point B, took probably 3 months. Compliance red teaming tends to take the longest. By the time we got to the end of it, we kind of realized on the offensive side that the product was going out to market or was already out to market, kind of that balance. And so the results of our red team really weren't important or considered during the product development cycle. They scheduled the red team for last just to get through the compliance without any goal of doing anything. So that's a pretty common thing that I found. The third value here of the red team exercise is more awareness of your security posture. Now, this is really the big value that you're going to want to look at and the thing to hone in for in terms of how do you future-proof your red team. The question when it comes to awareness is how good was your red team? And then the secondary follow-up that you got to have to ask yourself is the awareness that I gained proportionate to the time and money spent to get the awareness. And we'll talk about that in just a sec when it comes to the office red team that we just simulated. So evaluating what we just did with the office, let's look at these different assessments. So how good was the red team? A lot of people kind of assume that a red team is a red team and their skill set is comparable from one team to the next. In reality, it's a pretty, it's a skill set that's not very common. And so with that, you end up with a pretty significant amount of variation from team to team. And there isn't a lot of qualifications that are going to provide consistency. So just because you have a specific, say, ethical hacker certificate doesn't mean you're the same as another person with that exact same certificate. There's so much variance when it comes to skill sets that you need to kind of think about it through this lens. So if you hired a red team today and they find 10 vulnerabilities, you hire one next year and they find 5, was the first team better, or did your defense close the 5 holes? That's a really difficult question to ask. And if you struggle to answer that question in your organization, you'll need to find a way to kind of close the gap and get a little bit of a closer feel for where you stand there. How much did it cost? So if we look at just this office simulation red team, the real cost of running it is time for 3 to 5 days for the amount of staff, typically somewhere in the 20s, 20 or so people between red, blue, usually what's called the white team that kind of runs between them, purple team and so forth, management. So what's the real cost? You could calculate that out, and that's going to determine how often you can actually perform this. So if we're looking at the office assessment, maybe I can do that once a year. And that's pretty typical. So a lot of organizations will aim for that once a year red team without thinking through, am I getting, essentially this last point, am I getting the value that I anticipate that's proportionate with the amount of time and energy I'm putting in? So if I do a once a year red team, then I can get some value as long as I'm creating action out of the red team results. But that value starts to diminish over time as the system changes, as the network changes, as personnel change and new software is written. So you kind of have this diminishing result. And that's in your best case scenario, even if you are running one red team a year. I've seen some organizations, the bigger ones or the tech focused ones, tend to try to push for once a quarter. And you can balance a lot quicker there. You can kind of respond a lot faster. The diminishing value is only 1 quarter instead of 1 year. But at the same time, you're still kind of facing the same problem as let's say the used car deal, right? You're never going to, except for now in COVID time, I guess you're never going to really make money on a used car. The value is diminishing. And so that's sort of the same thing with the red team. The biggest value is right away, and you get the most bang for your buck right away. 6 months down the road, you start to lose that. So the big takeaway when it comes to understanding what is a red team is that the point of offensive security is to become aware of your vulnerabilities, your threats, your risks, and then use those to make iterative improvements. So these 3 terms we're going to define, and these 3 terms are often mistaken or kind of jumbled up, and people look at them as the same thing. And that is really the point of offensive security. So a vulnerability, defining these out, is a weakness or a gap in your protection efforts or non-efforts, your non-action. So that's a vulnerability. You have a weakness. A threat is anything, let's look at these actually. So a vulnerability could potentially be you have port 22, which is an SSH service port, open to the internet with a default password. That would be a vulnerability. You may have a server out of your thousands of servers in your infrastructure that has this scenario. See this all the time. You could use quite a few scanners to look online and find this exact scenario. That's a vulnerability. Now, it could be intentional, or it could just be unintentional because a system administrator opened it up and forgot that they left this open. SSH, if you're not familiar, obviously it can be used for remote access. Now, a threat is anything that can exploit a given vulnerability. So that could be, in our case, anybody that has access to the internet. That's a threat. If, say, port 22 was open to not just the internet, but open to a region of the United States, say the Southeast, well, now your threat's going to be any person with access to the internet and also physically located in the Southeast of the United States. So the threat could be as wide as this, any person with the internet, or it could be as narrow as a specific threat group or a person with a specific skill set. A risk is the potential loss if the threat exploits the vulnerability. So the theft or destruction to my private files or the network itself is my risk in this scenario. So this is the risk I have of keeping port 22 open to the internet with my default password. Now, the first instinct in this case, and this kind of goes into the vulnerability scanning world, it's I need to close all my vulnerabilities down. I can't have any vulnerabilities. As we know from scanners, that's really unrealistic because you end up with thousands of them and they are changing on a daily basis. And so you may look at this and say, well, what's the server? If the server is a dummy server and has nothing of value on it, or is a dev server without any valuable information, files, and so forth, well, now your risk is significantly lower because the threat to you, they cannot essentially exploit that vulnerability in a way that's going to put you at risk because there's nothing of value there. That'd be a lot different than if your server in this case was a production server with a lot of your most sensitive detail. Now your risk is very high because the threat would be able to exploit that and cause real harm to you. All right, tying this back to the red team, how does a red team technically produce value for you? So the way I kind of look at this, I described this a little bit through our simulation here. They're going to run a red team action. They're going to evaluate the results of the action. They're going to use the results of that action to balance the predicted effects of running a new action versus the odds of detection of that new action. And then they're going to go ahead and run that next action. Now you can squint and see this little screenshot I have off to the right side. This is a Nmap scan of prelude.org. And you can see I'm running a quick scan there, and I can see that there are 2 open ports, just common for pretty much any website, port 80 and port 443, HTTP, HTTPS. Now, a red team action, in our case here, red team action 1 is running the scan. I decided to start with something, I ran a scan. Now, I get this kind of text output, and I need to evaluate it in order to determine my next step. So this is the red team mental cycle of do an action, use my intuition, my own personal experience, and see if I can consume that knowledge in order to point myself in a new direction and choose a new task. Now, this is important because this is the foundation of automated red teaming, which is a big, scary word that we're going to jump into on the next slide that has gained a lot of prominence in the last 3 to 5 years. Now, the aspect of manual red teaming that you really want to kind of understand is this value proposition of run action, consume results, use that to predict your next action, perform action, and you're in this kind of loop. That's your manual cycle. Now, the constraint with a manual red team is they are constrained to what they know how to do and how good their evaluation of said results are. And so this is where we can kind of circle back to that. If a red team finds 10, vulnerabilities today and 6 months from now finds 5, which team was better? That's kind of your consistency problem. And so this is the reason. So there are certain red teamers that are better at evaluating results and determining what to do next because they all know different things. They know different attacks to run, and they also understand data at a different level than each other. All right, so let's extend all of this into automation. And this is really where we hit the meat of this presentation. How do we squeeze the most value out of offensive security? Hint, it's going to be automation. There are 2 types we're going to look at here. The first is really what I'd cover under breach and simulation. This is executing red team actions in sequential order. This is really the starting point to automation. And so in this case, we're taking away the evaluation of results. We are taking away the prediction, the weight of the that balance of will I be detected versus what is the value of running this next action. All of that goes out the window. We're taking, call that the human intuition, the human element. We're taking that out and we're saying, hey, we just want to run action 1, action 2, action 3, regardless of the output, we're just running these. Now, the reason you would do that is it's easy. It's incredible. If you have a solid engineer on your team, they could spin up a system that does this in a day, and you could point it at your development or production systems and have it running automatically on a daily basis and get value without spending a dollar. And so this is kind of your entry point into automated red teaming. And it requires very little when it comes to obviously cost, but also resources and infrastructure, especially if you leverage a lot of the open source communities that are built up around this specific problem set. Probably the most well-known and the one that I'd guide people toward if this is a new area to you is Atomic Red Team. The team at Atomic does a phenomenal job at supplying what are called TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures. These are singular attacks that can be strung together in this like red team action 1, 2, and 3. And you can just run as many of them that you want. And they're organized by tactic, things like lateral movement, things like discovery or exfiltration. So you kind of pick a tactic or category, if you will, and say, I want to run 10 of these a day for the next month. You get a good engineer, you can spin up an execution engine for it, and you just point it at your systems and go. And so that's a really quick and easy way to enter this automated red team space. Now, the con of that is obviously you're not getting, this isn't a replacement to a manual red team, but you are getting a significant value that you're able to set up in a quick way between manual red team assessments. Now, the second way is much more on that advanced decision-making, the human element side of automation. So I'm going to take you back to about 2015 when Mitre published a paper called Automated Adversary Emulation. This really sparked a lot of what we see in the breach and simulation space today, the automated space. And Mitre's paper focused on 3 areas. It's reasoning. How can you understand decision making in general? How do decisions get made? How do human beings make decisions? The second area, the second pillar here is knowledge. So your limited knowledge base impacts the decisions you make. You have a finite amount of things you know how to do. So if I'm a hacker, I know how to do, say, 500 attacks, and another hacker may know how to do 1,000 attacks. Well, we're going to have different decisions that we have in front of us that are possible. And so that's going to impact what I do. And then application. So the ability to apply reasoning against knowledge. So the planning, what I'll call the planning engine, how do you make your decision? And then what are the things that are fed into the planning engine to be decided against? And so Mitre's paper, and you can pull this up online, just Google search Mitre Research Adversary Emulation, you'll probably find this. It's about an 8-page probably research proposal, and it goes into this topic. Now, this research paper was the basis of the framework that I wrote when I was at Mitre, which is the Caldera Framework. And so we introduced a lot of these planning concepts into that framework, made it open source and available. So organizations like yours are capable of going off the ground and just using something that is pretty intuitive, but also intended to help you be more security conscious. And as I said at the beginning, my work on Prelude Operator is essentially my next stage into this exact game, an even easier version of what I did with Caldera that's intended for production systems for organizations to test their security awareness. All right, now, how does an automated red team utilize that Mitre paper essentially and automate the majority of these red team actions? So you'll see that this actually looks a lot like the value proposition of the manual red team. Run a red team action, evaluate your results, and then balance your predicted effects of your next action with your odds of detection. Run the red team action number 2 and kind of go through this cycle. So it's very similar. And so the question is, how can you actually do that? How does that work in an automated sense? How can you essentially be the human in the loop when it comes to automation? To answer that, we're going to look at how do you actually make human decisions. So think of this as kind of a crash course of that Mitre research paper, if you will, a very simplistic version. So we're going to start off on the left side, and we're waking up in the morning, and our goal was to drive to work. Between these 2 stages, moving left to right, are decisions. These are decision points, things that I could do. Anything red is a dependency. It means that I cannot do that step until I satisfy whatever dependency it requires. So when I wake up, I cannot immediately walk the dog. We're going to say that walking the dog has a dependency on me having clothes on. So I can't take my dog outside until I actually put clothes on. And so that's my dependency. So when I wake up, I immediately hit snooze. That does not get me any closer to driving to work. So that is an empty path. I cannot go that way. Think of this like a horizontal decision tree. That's not a path that's viable. But when I wake up, if I eat breakfast, maybe that allows me then to go put clothes on. Okay, so now I'm getting somewhere. I'm moving my way across from left to right. When I put clothes on, I've satisfied the dependency to walk the dog. So I'll go circle back to walking the dog. And then I'll say, hey, let me try to go for a run. Get blocked there. Cannot go for a run because that is not going to help me achieve my goal of driving to work. So if I back that step up, that decision up, I go and I get in the car, and then I'm able to drive to work, and I have achieved my goal. And so that's how humans make decisions in this simplistic world of consume information, make an action, react to the action, use my goal that I have in mind in order to move from one stage to the next. Now, what I just described for you here may sound familiar depending on what your math background is. This is a finite state machine. So they're a finite number, a set number of states I could be in at any given time, and a move from one state to the next depending on the decision I make. So this is the kind of subway turnstile, your classic finite state machine example of there being two states, locked and unlocked. When you put a coin in the turnstile, you move from one state to the next. Very simple. This gets used in math courses, classes all the time as your classic example. So when we look at this overlaid on our human decisions, we can see that what we've actually done is we've created 5 different states. So instead of 2 like a turnstile, we have 5. And as we move, we can go forwards and backwards, and we're making decisions through this finite state machine. Now, to throw a little cyber on it, as one of my teammates would say, we want to kind of look at this through the lens of security decision making. So what's called a cyber kill chain. So if you're not familiar with Mitre attack framework, the attack framework is, in the most simplistic definition, it is a definition or a common language of how adversaries attack systems. And so it's broken down into tactics, techniques, and procedures. So on this kill chain, we have things like persistence, which will be your tactic. There's probably 12 to 15 enterprise tactics. If you go to attack.mitre.org, you'll get a whole list of them. And a tactic would be, say, persistence. Underneath that tactic, you have a number of techniques. These are the ways an adversary could achieve the tactic or implement it per se. And so T1037 is going to be your technique identifier. They all start with these TIDs. And then your procedure is going to be your actual command that they're going to run, the script or the payload they use, the rat that they, run and that sort of thing. There's an innumerable amount of procedures because it's your implementation of your technique. And so this is how this 3-layer kind of description is how the Mitre attack framework is designed. Now, if we move to the next slide, if we want to overlay this and kind of replace our 5-state design from human decision-making with more of a kill chain look, it would look sort of like this. So you have 5 states moving from left to right still, but instead of waking up and hopefully driving to work, we're going to say that we are getting an initial access foothold, and our goal is exfiltration of important sensitive files out of the network. Now, I may go through these different tactics. Everything on the screen is a tactic on the attack framework, and I may have to go through these different tactics in order for me to get through my kill chain and perform exfiltration. So that's interesting and all, but how can we take this automation and actually bundle it, build it into something that we're able to secure our organization, get out of this kind of research mindset? Before we jump into the automation, that's on the next slide. This is kind of the teaser. You really need to focus on setting up your priorities. So quick definition of cyber hygiene here. But when I say priorities, a lot of large and small companies kind of think that they're running different security, policies and different processes, but it's pretty similar actually what their needs are, what their core needs are. And so for setting priorities, the very first thing, so this is all going to come before we even touch offensive security. The very first thing that you want to do is perform an inventory audit. Most organizations are quite bad at understanding what devices that they have in their organization. They don't know how many laptops they have, how many workstations, desktops, Chromebooks, servers, and so forth. When I've done red team engagements in the past, let me back that up, actually give a different example. So at one organization that I spent a few years with, I would join the incident response team and evaluate and give my perspective as an offensive cyber operator, how the adversary is moving around the network in real time as the incident responders would help find them and knock them out and repair the system. One of the things we always asked for out of the gate was, can you draw us, can we see your inventory? Can we see where all the devices are so we can kind of understand the potential attack vectors? Every organization kind of gave us a scribbled down list on the fly, had nothing really in the inventory audit for us to work with. So it was always kind of a shot in the dark. So the very first thing you should do is make sure that you understand the devices you have in your control. Then you want to layer on centralized logging. You want to have eyeballs on what's going on all of those different devices. You want to schedule patching and updating on all your devices. So you want to have those eyeballs. You want them to constantly be being patched and updated so you're on the most secure systems possible. Then you're going to go into some of the reactive defensive security posture. So you want to do vulnerability scanning and come up with a process for remediation and prioritization of your vulnerabilities. You want to implement some level of cybersecurity education for your staff, not just your cybersecurity people, but your overall staff, because as an adversary, what you're going to do is you're going to go after the people. About 80+% of the attacks that occur are people first. They go through your people in order to get on the systems. Then you're kind of ready to staff your internal security team. And finally, you're wanting to conduct your offensive security, your red team assessments. You want to kind of build your base with your security posture. This way, before you really jump into the most advanced form, which is your proactive cybersecurity, your assessments, there's all of these things that really add a lot more value if you don't have them. So you don't want to get ahead of yourself. Start working your way through this chart before you just dive to the most complex. And finally, the last slide here. All right, there it is. You're ready to get into offensive security and you're ready to do the automation. So how can I future-proof my offensive security team in order to, like, an actionable plan for tackling red teaming in offensive security without just doing manual red teaming and getting those diminishing results? The first thing is low-hanging fruit. Set up a continuous red team probing of your production systems. So we talked about the Atomic Red Team project and that kind of system of get a good engineer and have them take all those attacks that Atomic puts out and just hit your systems once a day, once a week, and see what is working and what isn't working. Take the human element out, set this up, do your low-hanging fruit. Your second thing, once you have that set up and running and getting value from it, you want to look at custom threats. Instead of just doing red action 1, red action 2, you want to feed this system with more real-world attacks and more custom APT type profiles that you're actually worried about, that may have a habit of attacking systems in your industry or companies like yours. And so now you're really taking your automated system, adding a little bit, sprinkling a little bit more value on it. Once you get past that and you're getting value from that, now's the time to really go deep on your defensive integration. So look for ways that you can hook your SIM, your logging, your different tools on your EDR dashboard, so forth. See if you can find ways to hook those into your new automated offensive work to understand what you are and are not seeing. And that's going to kind of give you that full circle of defensive and offensive help. And then finally, your very last cherry on the top is the manual overlay. And so now that you have an automated process established, now you can really get a lot more value out of your manual red teaming. And so if your budget allows, you can toss in that 1 or 2 manual red teams each year, and they're not going to find all the things that the low-hanging fruit and custom threats and integration points that they're going to find. You're actually going to get a lot more value because the red team is going to be forced into actually finding the tougher things, the things that an adversary that's persistent is going to be forced into finding, because you're going to solve all of your other things that you don't need to pay out of pocket, out of budget for the manual red team to find for you. You can find these through your automated processes. So this is where you can really get that extra value. Now, was going to take you out for a spin, but I know we are out of time. If you are interested in this whole area and how you can get that automated system set up for free using only open source technologies and so forth, feel free to shoot me a message or check out the work that I do openly online. And I'd be happy to kind of put you in contact with different people that can get you and your team off and running. And that's all I had. Thank you.
Well, thank you, David. I know that all of our attendees really enjoyed your presentation. There's lots of great comments in the session chat. Just a reminder to the attendees, if you do have any last minute questions, you can still type those in the chat and we can definitely get to those. But in the meantime, I do have one question for you, David, and that is, what do you think the future of manual red teaming is given this presentation?
Yeah, that's a great question that kind of sparks quite a bit, I think. So manual red teaming is definitely not going away. And I think a lot of red teamers, their first gut reaction when they kind of see the prominence of automated red teaming coming up, their first gut reaction is kind of like a factory worker back in the 50s. Don't tell them I said this, but this is kind of their first reaction. And it's, the robots are going to take my job and like, I'm not going to be able to do anything. The reality is there's always going to be a manual aspect to red teaming. It's always going to be needed. The thing that I would push red teams to do, or really not red teams as much as organizations to do when it comes to red teaming, is add automation and make your red team actually find the hard things. You can use your automated system to find 90% of the things they would find on day one. So really put that in, fix all those things first, and then bring your red team in and get the most for them.
That is great. I know the presentation, I loved listening to it. I know some of our attendees, they also loved your examples. You made everything so nice and easy to understand, especially for me. And I know some of the attendees also commented they loved the office, a great way to incorporate some fun interaction in there. I'm looking through the comments, not as many questions today, but definitely lots of nice comments. Great presentation, excellent presentation, well done. So definitely check those out. And to all the attendees, if you missed any part of this presentation, or if you want to go back and check it out, any specific points, we will have this video up on demand later today. But other than that, I tried to stall a little bit for any questions. It doesn't seem like there's any more questions for us today, but probably just because you explained everything so well.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.